It's the foundation for all of the technology that we're using and all the recommendations coming out of artificial intelligence. It's the foundation that we use for making diagnoses and for advising patients on how to go about living a life when you happen to have a non-communicable metabolic disease. What is that? That's the information we're using in order to form our basis for recommendations. Are we making recommendations based on misinformation? Is the curse of oversimplification causing us to make poor recommendations for health? And what can we do in terms of the takeaway messages that we see coming out of the most recent Health and Human Services study and the assessment, Make Children Healthy Again? Well, let's talk about that.
Warning. The following presentation contains information that might contradict what you have previously heard, or believed to be true, about how the human body works, and contains material that is not suitable for closed-minded individuals. Enjoy!
The report that we're looking at and the assessment we're looking at, the MAHA report in terms of Make Our Children Healthy Again, was first leaked in May of 2025 and actually was published in August, September 2025 with a whole host of various talking points coming out of it and a whole host of political talking heads giving their assessment as to what it means in terms of policy. We're not going to look at the policy mechanisms. We have written on the policy mechanisms in a most recent Substack, but we're not actually going to delve into the policies here. We're simply going to look at what is the science. Are we focusing on the misinformation, disinformation? Are we actually making good recommendations based off of what the science has to say as it relates to what recommendations are coming out of the report? One of the first things that they show, so we're going to start off by looking at the various evidence that they're reporting on, and then the recommendations that they're making, and then we'll kind of delve into all of the various aspects here. The first graph that they actually show in this report is this health expenditure and life expectancy. But there's a problem with what they're showing with this graph, is that they're showing it based off health expenditure per capita. And the problem with this graph is that it's based on a faulty assumption. The faulty assumption is that if we're spending more money, we should get better expectations, better outcomes. But the problem is that within the United States, the red dotted lines here, the model is a pay for play. That is, we are expending money in order to get services. We are expending money in order to get services is based off of a capitalistic viewpoint of health as opposed to a universal care aspect for health. And because of that, this is a faulty kind of graph to look at in terms of what is the actual life expectancy and is life expectancy actually gaining in terms of what we see for what we actually invest into it, because we're not actually investing very much because it is at a pay for play mechanism here. The other thing that we have to look at here is what are the ideals and what are the purposes that are being purported? What is the reason for the idea that we are looking at this report? The idea behind MAHA in terms of the ideology is that we are attempting to prevent diseases. Now, some of the policy doesn't match that prevention. The idea that we have to look at here is that America will begin to reverse childhood chronic diseases. It's an assumption that there's a crisis going on. While there is some evidence to support that crisis, it's not what the MAHA individuals, and particularly RFK Jr. as the talking head of the MAHA movement right now within the United States, it's not what it kind of is focused on. Particularly when we start looking at this pro-growth policy, because once again, it's going back to that graph we just looked at. It's about spending more money. It's about making it more capitalistic. And so what we're trying to do here is we're trying to say, okay, what is the actual points that they're making? Are they valid points? And do we have evidence to contradict, or do we have evidence to support what is being presented there? Because it's not about capitalism. It's not about policy. It's about health. And it's about what is the science that's there in terms of the indication as to whether or not we are going to be healthy or not. If we start looking at, once again, evidence that they are reporting out there in terms of all of the ideals about this Make America Healthy Again, if we start looking at who is qualified for military service, and it goes into what we talked about in terms of the presidential fitness challenge and the reinvention of it, put quotes around reinvention of it, to what it used to be before we made it more of a health-centric viewpoint. It's about making people be more qualified for military service, more physically fit, put quotes around physically fit for military service, because there's a whole bunch of aspects that come into fitness for military service. If we start looking at the prevalence of obesity and the prevalence of overfatness, there is this rise. However, it has plateaued. And that's something that's not being pointed out within any of the reports that are coming into play here. Part of this has to deal with some of the issues that we see. Part of this has to deal with some of the speculation that we see within the report. But a lot of it has to deal with how we measure this idea of obesity, particularly when we get above the age of about 10, once puberty starts to hit. When we look at between zero newborn and about 10 years of age during that juvenility phase, if we have high BMI, if we have high body mass index, that's the indication of excessive fat mass being accumulated, which is something we don't want to have. However, once puberty hits, you can start having excessive BMI, higher levels of BMI, which is the metric that is used for obesity, without having excessive fat mass. And that means that the measure of obesity, put quotes around the obesity, starts to falter once we start getting into puberty because the metric that we're using is a faulty metric, something we talked about previously. If we start looking at these pre-diabetic conditions, the pre-diabetic conditions is, once again, there is a rise. And there are a host of factors that are coming into play that are hinted at within this report, but are not actually gone into in terms of detail, something we've talked about ad nauseum. There is also this indication about food allergies and the prevalence of food allergies coming into play. Once again, there's a whole host of reasons for why food allergies can rise. Most of it deals with hypersensitivity within the immune response, and most of that hypersensitivity within the immune response is not because of the things put into the report, but has to deal with more about hypersterilization and dietary restrictions than it has to deal with what I'm actually eating or what environment I happen to be in terms of the things that are found within the report. So, what are the reasons that they are identifying as the culprits? And we're going to focus primarily on a couple of factors here because otherwise we'll be here for 5, 6, 7 hours discussing this. So what are the reasons that they are providing? Well, the food American children are eating, American children's exposure to environmental chemicals, pervasive technology use, the highly medications, the food industry, the chemical manufacturing industry, the pharmacological industry. All of the bigs, the big agro, the big tech, the big pharma. There's a whole host of blame, not just blame on the individual, but blame on the companies. There's a lot of scapegoating that comes into play. As we look at this, there is a lot of oversimplifications coming into play when we start looking at this. There's a lot of confirmation bias coming into play. There's a lot of I don't want to listen to a counter argument coming into play. I simply want to believe what I want to believe and not believe what I don't want to believe. There is a lot of perpetuation of the myths and mythos that we've seen and that we've discussed that are guiding some of the principles that do not actually make some of the recommendations scientifically valid. When we start looking at the way in which the setup within this whole assessment looks at, it's pulling in a lot of high school biology, high school chemistry, with not a lot of indication about what's being actually medically true. There's some purporting within some of the MAHA movement that they want to change the way in which medical education goes into play to incorporate nutrition, metabolism into this overall medical education that doctors, physicians, nurses get. There is some of that already taking place, but the problem is that there's already too much information that the doctors, that the nurses are already learning, and that there are specialists learning about nutrition, learning about metabolism that work with the doctors, that work with the nurses, that work with patients that need nutritional advice when it comes to metabolic issues. There's a lot of blaming about what types of foods are being eaten and the quality of foods, with the assumption that if I get it from a restaurant, it's bad, but if I cook the same exact thing at home, it's good. There's a lot of myths and misconceptions out there in terms of the quality of foods that are coming into play as it relates to, is it healthy or is it not healthy? A lot of what's going on here is that we're ignoring factual information. We are factually incorrect in terms of the information that's being presented to us in that MAHA report. And then we have non-existent and out-of-date references that are being used for supporting the points that are being made. We're ignoring the fact that the administration in its policies are cutting a lot of the funding and a lot of the research that are necessary to allow for all of the goals that are being set forth in that MAHA assessment, in that MAHA report. The recommendations are ignoring that the frontline workers, the ones that have the greatest level of influence, are unprepared and underprepared. This is something that we reported in our survey on K-12 educators. When we look at diet and nutrition or exercise in terms of recommendations, in terms of teaching, 70% that do any type of teaching teach from a personal experience bias, a confirmation bias. 55% of them do not look at primary or secondary sources. They get their information from social media. They get their information from news reports without actually getting into what was actually stated within the research that people like to cite. 80% feel that only those that are physically fit are qualified to state what should be best and what should work best. 40% have indicated following at least 2 fad diets within a year. 67% indicate having limited or no ability to change habits in their students or their colleagues because it is outside of their realm of control. And these are the educators. These are the K-12 educators, K-12 administrators, K-12 school site employees that have the greatest amount of contact with the children throughout the day, throughout the week, throughout the month, and throughout the year. They have the greatest level of influence outside of the family as it relates to changes in exercise, changes in diet, changes in nutrition, as well as understanding about health. The reports ignore the impact on coercion. When we start looking at if I'm going to be pro-health for long periods of time, anything that I do, it has to be self-selective. All of the recommendations, all of the reporting that comes out into this assessment is all about coercion. It's all about you're going to do what I want you to do, not what you want to do. You're doing it because I'm telling you to do it, and you're a good person because you're doing what I'm telling you to do. And if you're not doing what I'm telling you to do, you're a bad person. It's a moral laxity if we do not follow the recommendations. It's one of the things that comes into play when we start looking at all of the recommendations coming out of all of the MAHA issues. The recommendations are ignoring the complexity of physiology. They're ignoring the fact that we have a normal population response, and a normal population response is going to range from never respond to always respond. Not only is it going to be from never respond to always respond, the complexity within the human body, the complexity in between the interactions between ourselves and our environment, our social interactions, all have an impact on healthy behaviors and overall health. They all have impacts on body composition. They all have impacts on muscle mass. They all have impacts on all of my hormonal responses. All of these complex interactions, these swinging cogwheels, do not have a single factor that will limit the impact on all of the factors. So we can't say it's just because of this one thing and this one thing only that everything else is out of alignment. It's a complex machine, and that complex machine has to work in unison with everything. And so we have all these issues coming into play here. We have all of these various factors as it relates to the obesity issues, in terms of the overfatness issues. We have these issues in terms of we want to make sure that people are, quote unquote, physically fit enough to do military service. Stuff we've talked about previously in terms of the fact that, yes, doing challenges can be of benefit. Yes, it might get them off the couch, but we have to do it in such a way that we do not establish body image issues, do not establish bullying issues as it relates to body weight, as it relates to body composition, as it relates to body image. Because if we do it with some sort of bullying, with some sort of coercion, we can develop an aversion to distinct physical activities. We can set up for having mental health issues because of the bullying that takes place, because of the intrinsic factors that are coming into play as it relates to my body image and my willingness to do what I need to do and how I see myself relative to what I actually happen to be. If we start looking at this idea about the diabetic change, once again, we've talked about this diabetic change a lot, And a lot of the myths and misconceptions we have about diabetes and the fact that a lot of the blame wants to be on sugars, even though sugar is a measure of diabetic condition, it's not the cause of diabetic condition. And so, what are some of the factually dubious recommendations that we start seeing here? What are some of the issues that would come into play? Well, once again, a lot of it deals with the fact that, oh, there's these added sugars and this processed foods, this added sugar and the processed foods. With the quote, there are 17 teaspoons of, quote, additional sugar daily that equates to 60 pounds each year. Well, let's do a little math. There are 454 teaspoons in a pound. 454 teaspoons in a pound times 60 pounds tells me that I need to have 27,240 teaspoons in order to get 60 pounds. Well, if I'm eating 17 teaspoons a day for 365 and a quarter days per year, that's only giving me 6,290.25 teaspoons. That is not 60 pounds. I repeat, that is not 60 pounds. Along with that, that 17 teaspoons of quote unquote additional sugar is made up. Not only is it made up, we need sugar in our diet in order to be metabolically active. Our neurons work on glucose. Glucose is a sugar. Muscles use glucose. Glucose is a sugar. Our immune cells work on glucose. Glucose is a sugar. One of the things that everybody gets all bent out of shape about when we start looking at this added sugars and these processed foods and the amount of sugar within the processed foods is that they think that any bit of sugar is going to cause insulin to spike. And insulin now is the boogeyman in terms of hormones. But if you ask any bodybuilder that was doping back in the day, one of the things they would dope on is insulin. And the reason why they doped on insulin is not because of sugar regulation, it's because insulin allowed for proteins to be built and muscles to grow. Insulin, yes, has an impact on sugar regulation in terms of upregulating, moving into the membrane of skeletal muscle, adipose tissue, and the liver. Receptors that are going to move glucose from the bloodstream into those tissues. But everywhere else in the body, all the other tissues in the body, all the other cells in the body, insulin is going to stimulate building structures, building molecules, building proteins. Yes, it may have an impact on building lipids within certain cells, particularly the adipose cells, the fat cells, but that's the only place it's going to be. And so this whole worry about added sugars places the burden on the wrong thing when we start looking at this nutrition issue. It starts labeling foods as being good and as being bad. It starts indicating that fast food is bad for you because of all of the other things that are found within the fast foods, the food preservatives, the dyes, all of the other things that we start looking at without looking at where foods are being prepped and how foods are being eaten may have an impact on how much I'm eating, not whether or not how many calories I'm eating or what those foods happen to be. One of the things that comes into this idea here is that we're eating high calorie, nutrient poor foods. Well, the only way that I can get a calorie is from eating nutrients, in particular, proteins, lipids, carbohydrates. Yes, there are other nutrients that we need, and that's because we have to look at this not as calories, but as the nutritional load that we need. Calories are not the end all of the conversation as relates to weight, even as what is being presented within the report. Within this, once again, there's this talk about additives and artificial food dyes, and this talk about additives and artificial food dyes has a point to it. However, the stretch that they go, there's this excessive oversimplification of what these chemicals do and how these chemicals act. Just because we see chemicals acting one way in one situation doesn't mean they act the same way in all situations. And this is where we start getting these recommendations about, well, there's too many sweeteners and there's these seed oils, and the seed oils and these sweeteners are metabolic disruptors. It may be the case, but we don't have the evidence to support that. Then there's this idea about the fact that they're not eating enough Beef, they're not drinking enough whole milk. Once again, we've talked about the whole milk thing when the whole kerfuffle about getting whole milk back into the schools based off of the fact that there is low fat milk and two fat milk and one fat milk and whole milk and skim milk. The ideas behind the limited drinking of milk, the limited consumption of beef it's a non sequitur. It's something that is not actually going to get us to where we need to go in terms of these claims about diet and nutrition that's going into coming into play here. But once again, what we're looking at this misconception of good foods and bad foods, where yes, there can be metabolic disruptors in there. Yes, sweeteners may act as a metabolic disruptor. Yes, fructose may act as a metabolic disruptor. Yes, other things within the body may act as metabolic disruptors. When we start looking at this idea about metabolic disruptors, it's about toxicity, which means that a single consumption of something is not going to cause all of these things to come into play. It's about dose and duration. And it's that dose and duration thing that is missing within all of the conversations that we're seeing within this MAHA report, as well as within other reports that are being cited by the MAHA movement. Now we get to the food pyramid discussion. And this is where we get the infamous 1992 food pyramid, which was influenced by the sugar industry, recommended carbohydrates at the base of the pyramid and with no differentiation between refined grains and whole grains. Well, let's take a look at the food pyramid. Here's the food pyramid. And I'm seeing a differentiation between refined grains and whole grains. I'm seeing a differentiation between refined sugars and whole sugars. I'm seeing differentiations. The boogeyman that they're laying out here in terms of the food pyramid is something that was actually corrected in terms of serving sizes, in terms of recommendations, something that we've discussed within our dogmatic diets book, something that we looked at in terms of the fact that we have moved from the food pyramid, where we had the food servings and the indications of how much you should have within each day, and the indications of what is healthy and what is not healthy, to the My Plate, where it becomes a little bit more understandable in terms of how to break up each meal so you're able to get the constituent macronutrients and micronutrients necessary, including what should be done, what should be consumed sparingly with what should be consumed in large quantities. And that sparing versus large quantities goes into the discussion we had in terms of our macro elements, our micro elements, our trace elements. What do we need in most? What do we need in less? What do we need in excessively limited amounts? Then we get to this idea about environmental chemicals are to blame. And so we know that it's not the food pyramid because the food pyramid is no longer a thing. Now we get to this idea about it's all of these chemicals that are being exposed to, the heavy metals, the air pollutants, the pesticides, the endocrine disrupting chemicals. All of these quote unquote disruptors of our metabolism that somehow are dangerous to human health because they quote cause obesity or quote cause cancer or quote cause nervous system issues or quote cause early puberty or quote cause cardiovascular disease or quote cause liver disease. Notice all these things are in quotes because most of the research that we have is done in animal models where animal models might show stuff occurring, but the dose and duration that leads to toxicity is far beyond what we see in terms of what is normally consumed by humans. So let's break some of this stuff down. What about the bisphenols, the BPA in particular, which is one of the things that is now on almost every label. It says do not use this because it has BPA in it or it's now BPA free. What about the glyphosates in terms of what they do? And so we have glyphosates, we have BPA, we have these chemicals that have a metabolic effect, have an endocrine effect because they can mimic estrogen pathways, because they can cause ROS damage, because they can change DNA sequencing that can lead to a carcinogenic effect, that can alter tryptophan and alter tyrosine metabolism within the brain, that can lead to changes in dopamine and changes in serotonin pathways within that. Well, here's the problem with that. The organophosphates, the fertilizers, and the glyphosates, the fertilizers. Once again, these we're looking at the fertilizer issues here. They may have a metabolic and endocrine disrupting effect, but it's not through eating. It's through environmental exposure and breathing in or exposure on skin, not exposure on the foods that we are eating. There's limited evidence to support the model if food is washed once it's exposed to those fertilizers. There's very little fertilizer left in most of what is being sold. There's very little fertilizer left in what is being sold in packaged foods because all of that stuff has been washed. And we can even reduce the exposure to organophosphates and glyphosates by looking at utilization of genetically modified organisms and genetically modified crops that limit the need for the fertilizers and the pesticides. What about the bisphenols? What about the other bisphenols that we're looking at? The BPSs, the BPAs that we see within chemical molecules that are necessary for packaging. What about the phytosterols that we get from plants? Once again, there's a lot of discussion about these things being bad for you in terms of the indication that there is a danger that can occur. Once again, these things are acting as estrogen agonists. So the BPA, the BPS, a lot of the phytosterols, they have estrogen-like chemicals. They have an anti-androgen effect. This is where people talk about, oh, well, it's disrupting normal male metabolism, normal male metabolic functions because it's disrupting testosterone. It's causing excessive esterification of the body. Well, here's the problem here. The bisphenols and the phytosterols may impact reproductive function by acting as estrogen mimics. However, the amount necessary to consume is far beyond what is normally consumed in order to disrupt normal testosterone functions. The bisphenols may impact the development of reproductive cancers, but they do not have an impact on any other reproductive functions. But once again, the dosage that were given to the animals that showed these cancer developments is far beyond what we see in terms of what we normally consume for a normal human. The phytosterols may impact bone mineral density by altering estrogen activations within estrogen activating pathways in the bones. But we get a positive benefit from bisphenols. We get a positive benefit from phytosterols because they have estrogen-like characteristics. They will reduce ROS damage and they will reduce cardiovascular disease. There's a reduction in ROS damage, there's a reduction in cardiovascular disease for individuals that have higher phytosterol consumption of leafy greens, consumption of plants that contain phytosterols, consumption of soy or tofu. But once again, as long as it is not in excessive amounts, and that's the key here, excessive amounts. Well, what about nitrogenous chemicals? What about all of the nitrates that we get in the processed meats? Because we hear about all these processed meats having bad things for us. It's the same thing we see in terms of the seed oils, in terms of cooking stuff. By themselves, not that bad. If we cook them at excessively high temperatures, there can be oxidation taking place within the molecules that can trigger ROS damage that may cause diseases to come into play here. There is some indication that excessive nitrate consumption can promote insulin secretion, but that is minimal, particularly since excessive nitrate consumption of nitrates to allow for excessive amounts of nitrous oxide have a positive benefit as relates to preventing cardiovascular disease, improving blood pressure, acting as an anticoagulant, acting as an anti-inflammatory, preventing liver stasis, preventing hypercholestemia, improving muscle function, improving muscle power, improving muscle endurance. Most of the concern that we look at in terms of the nitrates, particularly nitrates around food and around all of the concerns, is not about harm to the body, but harm to the environment. Yes, there is a risk for interference with hemoglobin. However, we do not consume enough nitrates to have that issue. Even children don't have that in terms of the amount of nitrates that they can consume. What about the dubious claim that children are less active? Well, part of this has to deal with structure. Part of this has to deal with the fact that, yes, given all of the environmental stresses, there is an indication for a decreased trend in physical activity. And that decreased trend is not within the school age population that most of the MAHA recommendations are focused on, which is elementary school. Most of those downward trends is happening once we hit junior high school, once we hit high school in terms of age range. And that reduction is more linked with not the ability to do stuff, not the ability to have play stations, not the ability to have play parks, not the ability to have play time within the school, because most of the elementary schools have play areas. Most of it has to do with the fact that the structure of the school day is having the children sit. The increased sedentary time for children, for adolescents, for juveniles, is based on school structure, not on limited ability to be active. Small changes in school structure can lead to increased physical activity availability. Now, that school structure issue leads to a secondary issue here. And the fact that teenagers are sleep deprived and that sleep deprivation leads to increased stress issues. Increased stress issues very similar to loneliness and social isolation issues. And once again, it goes back to the structure of the school day. The structure of the school day is for the administrators and for the teachers. It's not for the students, because we are not basing how we go about doing education off of circadian regulations, sleep wake cycles, but off of the industrial 9 to 5. If we were to get the school day to go with the normal sleep wake circadian regulation for teenagers, school day would not start before 10 a.m. And that's because of when do teenagers start to feel sleepy, when are teenagers most awake, and how many hours of sleep teenagers need in order to have recovery and growth that is necessary during pubertal development. For younger elementary students, having that 7 a.m., 8 a.m. start time is perfectly fine, because their rhythms have them up and active by that point in time. However, for teenagers to have that same start time, if not an earlier start time based off of needing buses and needing to move stuff around, it doesn't align. And because it doesn't align, it puts them into sleep deprivation. And that sleep deprivation causes stress issues. And those stress issues lead to additional issues. When we start looking at all of the dubious claims that comes into what is coming out of the report, everything is related to insulin, everything is related to metabolic health and metabolic diseases, even though not everything is related to insulin, nor is everything related to health issues or diseases. There is no recommendation to the real culprit for teenagers as it relates to particularly the sleep deprivation, and that's the start and end of the school day. There is very limited evidence that we start looking at in terms of the real culprit in terms of inactivity. And that is the need to have more PE and more activity time within each day of the school, because we have too much time sitting during the day at school. When we start looking at all of the various dubious claims that are being presented within the MAHA report, most of it does not fit what we know in terms of the scientific evidence. Once again, we've talked a lot about that in previous discussions, in previous podcasts, in previous written stuff in Substack, as well as in a lot of stuff that we've published as relates to what causes the issues to come about and what we can do to alleviate them. And that doesn't even come into what we talk about in terms of the food allergy issues and the fact that most of the food allergy issues that are coming about is not because of the pesticides, it's not because of the herbicides, it's not because of the other environmental chemicals. Most of the food allergies come about because of hypersterilization during infancy where the infant is not exposed to various types of proteins, various types of pathogens, various types of antigens within the environment that will prime the immune system to react normally. Or diet is excessively restrictive, and the restriction on the diet leads to an increased likelihood for developing food allergies later on. The more global the diet for the infant, the more global the diet for the child, the more global the diet for the juvenile, the more global the diet for the adolescent, the less likely that person is to develop food allergies. The more restrictive, the more likely, which means that we want to make sure that children are eating a gambit of foods across a spectrum of qualities so that they reduce the likelihood of developing any type of food allergy, any type of gut health issue as they age. Something we discussed when we start looking at what causes hypersensitivity. I'm not going to get too much into this idea about the mental health issue because we've talked about the mental health issue before, but most of the mental health issues that we look at in terms of the, particularly for the teenagers, it's not so much the mental health issues within the elementary school, even though we are starting to see that come into play. Most of it has to do with how we interact with each other within the environment. The other thing is that we have a lot of comparison going on within a brain that cannot differentiate reality from fiction. They cannot differentiate what they see on their screens versus what they see in the real world. And they think everything in the real world matches what's on the screen, where they constantly feel like they have to be on as if they are living in their own television series, their own YouTube series, their own TikTok series, where they are constantly projecting out, where they have this constant FOMO going on, fear of missing out, where they have this constant, I'm comparing what I look like to what I see online, what I see within popular press. It's leading to a whole bunch of body image issues. It's leading to a whole bunch of loneliness issues. This is why we talked about almost a year ago now, actually a little bit over a year ago now, the need to have warning labels on social media, because the pervasiveness of the messages that we get on social media can have a negative health outcome by impacting our mental health. And we'll get more into this with a subsequent talk as relates to the mental health issues coming into play. But we wanted to focus more on the issues as it relates to the diet and the exercise, and the fact that there is not a lot that is actually factually correct in terms of what is being presented within that MAHA report, scientifically speaking. Well, thanks for listening. Hopefully got a bit out of the conversation. Thanks for watching. Hopefully got some new information, something that challenges your thoughts. If you have challenged thoughts, if you have comments, if you have questions, please make sure you leave those in the comments for us. We're more than happy to talk about that. If you haven't already done so, please make sure you subscribe. Please make sure you're liking what we're putting out there. If you like what we're putting out there, please make sure you're sharing what we're putting out there if you like what we're putting out there. If you have questions or comments, make sure you leave it for us. Once again, we'll be more than happy to discuss it. Please make sure you're following us here on YouTube as well as on the podcast. The Rinse Stuff is Substack, the quick takes on Instagram, Threads, and now on Bluesky.